So I'm with Christopher Theofanidis, and this is his brand new piece, The Legend of the Northern Lights. You just had a rehearsal.
Yep.
You've just heard it for the first time. Are you going to run home and make a lot of changes?
You know, it's funny, like the first rehearsal, I'm always prepared for any kind of disaster, and I kind of have a really laid-back attitude for the first rehearsal, but it went really, really well. Like the orchestra came together, they figured out the piece in really quick time, so I feel unusually good about this particular moment. And the stuff that we'll work on tomorrow is really the coordination of the video, the narration, and the music together to get it synced, just so, which is a great place to be in.
So it sounds the way you thought it would.
Yes, yeah, it does, and the balances are actually pretty good, and so forth. So the kind of notes that I was giving today, which were really kind of fine-tuning notes, I usually wouldn't give to like the second rehearsal. So I'm kind of glad to be there.
Earlier today, I was listening to another piece that you wrote about atmospheric conditions, I suppose, and light, and that is Rainbow Body.
Right.
I couldn't help thinking, tell me if you think this is true, that if you had not grown up listening to synthesizers, as we all have, that you would be a different composer, that there were so many colors and sounds and effects that you create in your orchestration. That do you feel like it's the electronic world has influenced you?
Yeah, that's a really good point, and yes, the answer is a resounding yes. I mean, I think electronic effects, the way you can filter and process sound and make things kind of have different kind of background results that you normally wouldn't be able to get with just a straight ensemble, has made me try harder to kind of consider those things. So, you know, processing sound so that it has a kind of a lingering resonance, you know, things that are really hard attacks that you can get really crisp on and offs from digital music, and you can't normally with. I try to build that into the orchestration, so it absolutely has affected that.
I also had a sense that your melodic lines moved more freely between instruments that wouldn't necessarily be written in a melodic line 100 years ago. Like you might go from cellos to trombone all within one tune.
That's true, yeah, that's true. Kind of spread the wealth around in a way and let people kind of share in the main participation in the melodic line. I mean, I think one of the things we kind of learn when we're writing music is you know, how long somebody's not playing. Like when you look at somebody's part and you see all this empty measures, you think, I want to give them something fun to do, you know? And the trombones, by God, they're going to be playing something interesting too if I can make it happen. So yeah, that kind of way of thinking is good, and usually the players really appreciate it.
Do you have some places in this piece, and if you want to open up the score, that's fine, where players are producing sounds that you needed to teach them to do, or you had to explain it?
Yeah, okay, just to show you the score. So, you know, in sorry, there are a lot of notes in here from today's rehearsal and so forth, but there's a moment towards the beginning, and this music comes back a couple of times, where you see images of the sun kind of they call them CMEs, the kind of ejections from the sun of kind of fiery matter and that
coronal
kind of
mass ejections.
Yeah. And so at that moment, for example, one of the things that happens here is you get a kind of real rushing sound between timpani and bass drum, and then this kind of very shrill kind of sound that happens with the screaming high winds and so forth and brass. And one of the things that's hard to get players to do is to really cut loose and be shrill, and because they want to make a controlled, beautiful sound. So part of it is, you know, giving them permission to really go for it and not make a pleasant sound from time to time. So things like that were really helpful to be able to do, to be able to kind of emphasize in person.
Oh. Does that, when you think about publishing a piece, do you have to think about how to describe that so somebody who doesn't have the benefit of sitting with you can play it?
Absolutely, yeah. And in fact, you know, this is the first pass of the piece, so what I'll do after that is go back into the score and do things like I'll write actual words, shrill, and things like that, and try to give more specific indications of the kind of sound that I want, because I know now what's not so obvious to the players from this kind of playback session. So, and I do that with most of my scores. So after the first, I don't publish usually the material until after the first set of rehearsals, because I'll know how to sharpen up the kind of verbiage and the indications of the music.
And I imagine there are two lives for this piece. I mean, first of all, I guess this is a two-part question. Do you imagine this Millennium Park audience, or did you when you were writing this? And does that affect the way you write the piece, that it's being written for families in a big public park outdoors? And then when you go to publication and you think about how to notate it, what kind of life it will have, can it be performed without the visuals and so forth? What are the two sides of that?
Right. So, I mean, I knew obviously that it was going to be performed here, and I've also had a piece played with this orchestra in the past, so I kind of had a sense of what it was like to have a piece played in this space. And then secondly, I've been here on kind of film night when they've shown a film up there and had a sense of like the kind of crowds that it draws and that kind of thing. And knowing that you're writing for 12,000 people instead of 1,500 people or less is a big motivator to understand how to approach the sound world, and the sense of kind of oration that things are projecting out that far. Of course, here there's a wonderful amplification system, so everything is kind of helped along by that. But I think that in general, the gestures, the way I try to communicate in here, it happens on a bigger scale than I would usually approach.
More tonal and more accessible, you think?
This piece is very tonal and extremely accessible, and it's really meant to be a family piece. I mean, it's a children's story, in fact. So, there's that in terms of the communication, but I don't usually, think so much about whether or not it's tonal or not tonal. It's mostly, does it justify the drama? Does it tell the story that you want to do? So have the harmony support that. So, and then about the publication and where it gets done after here, so we have one performance set up for the fall in Anchorage, Alaska, which should be really neat given the subject matter. And that's going to be inside of a concert hall, so it'll be a very different kind of experience from this one. And I'm kind of curious to see if we have to scale back things like the dynamics and things like that to make that work. But our hope is that it gets picked up by pops orchestras, by main kind of symphony orchestras in different locations, and we have a couple of different ways of presenting it. And we've also talked about the fact that yes, theoretically it could exist as a tone poem, done without the film or the narration. Though it would, knowing what the original thing is, it might feel a little funny to me personally not to have that in there.
When did you first see the visuals for this piece?
So the way we worked, we actually had a couple of early meetings all together about what the story would be and how it would be presented, and where music and video would dominate, and where the storyline and the narration would dominate, and how to spread that out. So that took a while before we got to that stage. As we were doing that, at the same time, Jose was actually going to these different locations in Yellowknife, and I think in France, and then also in different locations, and collecting kind of raw footage of video. And he shared some of those with us as we went along. So I had some of the visuals, though not in a linear way. I didn't know how it was going to be presented in order or anything like that. But I had some of that mental imagery to kind of work off of when I was doing that. And he also, some of the sun imagery and this imagery from the International Space Station, he had forwarded me to. So although it wasn't in order, it was very much part of the thinking.
So it's not like when Prokofiev was writing a ballet and he knew he needed X number of beats for this kind of gesture or whatever.
Exactly. Well, the only thing I would say is once we have the narration in there, it's very synced to the narration. So, and that's one thing we for the first rehearsal we were a little bit off kilter about. Like the music came together, the video, but we have to kind of really time out the way the music interacts with the narration because it's pretty closely synced. The places where it's a little bit more expansive in these 5 and 6 and 7 minute chunks of music where it's just video, it has a little bit more flexibility because Jose can start a cue at a slightly later point or an earlier point, and it works out all right. So.
Do you see yourself doing this again?
Oh, I'd love to. Yeah. I've done that piece that you mentioned, Rainbow Body, actually has. It's had a couple of incarnations where it's been with video from the Hubble Space Telescope or photography and things like that, and I love that kind of presentation of things. It's not the only way I want to do my work, but it certainly adds something to it, and it's kind of interesting to think about syncing things like that. I've done ballet and opera and things like that, and I generally enjoy collaborative working.
Fabulous. And so what is the orchestration for this piece?
It's full orchestra. I mean, standard orchestra with triple winds and full brass complement and just pretty standard symphony orchestra.
So if we can do a quick tour of your score, since it's sitting here.
Sure.
You want to open up to a page and describe what's happening on the page.
Sure.
And
Okay.
what will be happening in the
Okay,
story and the visual.
Like fun. Okay, well, I can do that in a couple of different places. So, for instance, here in the score, letter double M, and Carlos always comes up with a great, when you're telling players where to start for rehearsal, you have to say a word in addition to that. So he'll say something like double Maria, and he'll start there. But so in this part, it's just the strings. All the orchestra is filtered out, and the strings are kind of in this soupy way, glissandoing between notes. This kind of motion. And what you see on the screen is kind of a sliver of the Northern Lights that's kind of snaking in slow motion back and forth, and it basically sets the mood for this. It's kind of a mysterious looking thing with a lot of potential, and so that's what we try to sync in the music, for example. If I go to another part, I can show you some narration. Let's see, maybe. Let's see here. Yeah, so here you can see, for example, some narration. For instance, here you can see where the snowy mountains lay against the horizon like a sleeping bear rested a trapper's cabin, tucked away on a cushion of newly fallen snow. The world lay silent, except for the whooshing sound of a dog sled traveling across the frozen landscape. And you have kind of some pictorial descriptions of that, so it's a very placid kind of music that's happening. And then when you get the cue for the whooshing dog sled, it becomes quite piquant and very brittle sounding, and has a kind of a frosty feeling to the music and so forth. So I think it's synced, and the reader would read here and try to stay more or less in time with the music. So in fact, in this case, Frank Babbitt can actually read music and knows where to start the text in order to be lined up with the orchestra.
That's pretty huge, isn't it? Having a narrator who can read music.
Absolutely, and it was one of the things we had to decide pretty early on was if we wanted to have somebody who the conductor would point to when they wanted to, but we wanted a lot of interaction between the music and the text. And so the idea was to keep it as crisp as we could. We needed somebody who can actually follow the music and the musical score and so forth. So, yeah.
Excellent. So who do you have coming to be in the crowd with you for this?
Oh, we've invited a lot of people, and my kudos to KB265 who've organized this magnificently, and they've invited about a half a dozen conductors who are interested in picking up the piece, and some other organizations, and I think people from the Canadian Arts Council are going to be here who loaned us some of the visual imagery from the Canadian Space program and so forth. So it'll be a kind of a neat mix of people who are interested not only in this particular iteration of the project, but possibly for the future too.